topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Welcome to Life with Open Pages. We all have a purpose in life. Sometimes we just need a little motivation to point us in the right direction. This show is designed to help you create the life you were meant to live. I'm your host, Michelle Bannister. My goal is to motivate you to make simple life changes so you can experience a life with meaning, direction, love, and peace. Now let's start the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of Life with Open Pages. I'm Michelle. And tonight we're going to talk about how to overcome adversity and be successful. You know, from loss and abandonment as a child to molestation, suicidal thoughts, a near fatal car accident, and much, much more. My guest, Francine Tone, will help us to understand how to overcome difficulties and how to get our lives together despite the worst of the worst happening. Please welcome to the show, Francine Tone.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, I'm so happy that you're here. And go ahead and tell everybody where you're coming from right now, where you're calling in from.
I'm calling in from Hawaii.
Wow. Which is so lovely to hear because so much of the weather in the States is so bad right now. So, but we do welcome you to the show. We thank you for being here.
Well, thank you.
So tell us about yourself, Francine.
Well, you know, this show is about overcoming adversity. And sometimes when I talk to people, I tell them I have like about nine lifetime movies in my life. Like one of my stories is enough to knock somebody off their feet. And I had multiple. And so it began when I was just a young child. And it actually, in my mind, it started when I was about 5 years old. Mm-hmm. And I was outside playing. And I was living in Japan, living on a military base. And I'm outside playing with my friends. And it was one of those hot, humid summer days in Japan. If you've ever been to Japan, you know what I'm talking about. And the mosquitoes were buzzing in the air. The smell of DDT was everywhere. And suddenly my friends began running circles around me, yelling, "Your mother is dead. Your mother is dead. Your mother is dead." Oh my. And they continued to do this until finally I just broke down crying and I ran home, burst through the door into the kitchen where my mother was fixing dinner. Mm-hmm. And she said, "What's wrong?" And I blurted out through my tears, "They're saying you're dead." Oh. And that evening, my parents sat me down and I found out that my friends were correct. My mother had died when I was 1 year old. My real father left me with my Japanese grandmother. My mother was Japanese, mm-hmm. and my father was an American military man. And he left and never came back. And I lived with my Japanese grandmother for my first, year 2 to 5. Mm-hmm. And when I was 5, I was adopted. My Japanese grandmother wanted me to be raised as an American in the United States because I was half Japanese, and she thought that would be a better life for me. So she was doing the best she could to give me the best shot at a great life.
Sure.
So that night, when my parents told me the truth, they spent a lot of time, especially my adopted father, a lot of time telling me how special I was because I'd been chosen, not just born into a family, but I was actually selected. I was chosen. So that night I went to bed feeling pretty good about myself. A few weeks later, I found out how special I was when one night I'd gone to bed, wasn't quite asleep. The door was closed and my adopted father came into my room and began touching me in ways that I did not understand. And that was my life until I was 20 years old when I finally left home. And during that time, you can imagine a small child having nowhere to turn to. Before I was 6, I had no one to trust, no one to turn to. Mm-hmm. And I remember as a young person thinking, why doesn't my mother do something? And years later, when I later became an attorney, I was reading a book because it involved one of my cases. And it was the first book written on battered women syndrome. And I'm reading the book, and I was shocked to learn all the symptoms they were talked about the book were symptoms I'd seen with my mother. And now I understood why she couldn't help me. But as a young child, one of the things that I did was I realized that daytime, when my father was at work and I was home, this was summertime still, daytime was my time. And I took that time as my own, and I went to the playground, and I swore I would be better than the boys at the monkey bars, and I was. And that was my escape and my salvation, because that's where I learned for the first time how to set goals to become accomplished within my little world when there were parts of my life that I had no control over. And that became kind of a threshold idea in my whole life, that when you don't have control, find something very small that you can control and put your time and energy into that, and let that be kind of a guiding light to moving forward in your life.
So, how did you deal with that as a child? I mean, I understand that, you would try to excel in other things to take the pressure off of what you were really going through at home. But having no one to talk to, did you ever turn to anybody at that time?
No, I held that in me, and I will say this: if you have an opportunity to if you're in a situation like mine, don't do what I did. I held it inside of me my whole life. I was married to my current husband for 20 years before he even found out, and it's not something you want to hold in. And I think that you would recover from it faster, and certainly move forward in life little faster if you found a mentor, someone you can confide in, some other adult, a school teacher, a friend, anyone to confide in. And especially today, there are so many services out there. Back then, people didn't talk about that. In fact, I was keeping secrets in my life. That was one of them. The other secret I kept was the fact that I was adopted. I was told that night, even though I went to bed feeling very special, that I wasn't supposed to talk to anybody about the fact that I was adopted. That was a secret. And that's something that I've expressed to several people, is keeping secrets is damaging.
Sure.
And it's harmful in many ways, because that means a significant part of your life you have to push under, and secrets are just bad for you. People get heart conditions, stomach conditions, a lot of mental health issues because you keep secrets. And I had two big ones. One, I was adopted, and two, I was being molested. And my adopted father would tell me I had to keep it a secret. So I did. I was an obedient, child. I was born and raised Japanese, but many people, with their cultural backgrounds, doesn't have to be Japanese. It can be other cultures, about being an obedient child. And if you're told to keep it a secret, you do. And I'm telling you, don't keep anything secret. Sometimes it's hard to blurt out the truth, and sometimes you have to find the right time and place to do it. But don't keep secrets, especially when it's hurting you. And what I did, and I think it was my salvation, was coming up with other things to do. And what happened was, when I was 8 years old, I moved to the United States because my father was in the military. And we moved to the United States, and I came to the U.S. for the first time. And shortly after that, I began watching the Perry Mason show. And everybody's familiar with that, but that was back in the day when it was black and white. And I watched the Perry Mason show, and every week somebody would come in to him being accused of homicide, murder usually. And they would come in basically saying, "You're the only one I can trust. You're the only one I can turn to. I'm innocent. Help me." And I watched it week after week. And Perry Mason became my mentor, my idol, this fictitious character, because I started trusting him, and I started wanting to be like Perry Mason, because this was the person other people could turn to. You're the only one I can trust. You're the only one I can turn to. And that's really what prompted me to become a lawyer. Is I didn't have anyone to trust, and I didn't have anyone to turn to. And I knew that it was a horrible feeling inside, not having that. And after week, I decided, I want to be that person that other people can turn to and other people can trust, because I know what it's like, feels like not to have that. And that's what prompted me to become an attorney.
Right. So tell us about your teenage years. You said you contemplated suicide. Um, Thinking about it, of course, did you ever act on it? Because I think if you wouldn't that have been a giveaway that something was going on?
Right. And I can still picture myself in my bedroom at night, always at night. I'm laying there trying to go to sleep. And these were nights when I was being left alone
Mm-hmm.
and just thinking about, okay, different ways to end my life and just
Mm.
thinking about it. And what stopped me was, well, if I do that, how can I be someone else's Perry Mason?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that's what stopped me. And so that's why I say, if you feel like something's happening to you and you feel like you have to keep it a secret, find someone to tell the secret to, and look around you, looking for an idol, a mentor, somebody you can look up to,
Mhm.
and let that person help you create a vision or an image or something in the future where you can rise to be the person. I love the title of your show, to live the life you are meant to live that life that you want,
Yes.
and have that vision in your mind, because that's what kept me from actually doing something about my suicidal ideations, which I
Hmm.
had almost every single night.
Wow. So did you have a lot of friends growing up, or did you kind of keep to yourself because you had these secrets that you needed to protect?
That's interesting because I did not have many friends. I had a lot of acquaintances, but I always felt like an outsider, in part for many reasons. One, I was a military brat, and meaning I traveled and moved around. And so
Sure.
by the time I'm in high school, I'm in a school where everybody went to kindergarten with each other. They
Hmm.
know each other very well. I'm a newcomer, so I'm an outsider in that sense. I'm half Japanese and half white. And
Hmm.
back then, that was an unusual kind of look. And I didn't discover Hawaii till much, much later in life as an adult, where I feel very comfortable here because everybody is multicultural, have ethnic backgrounds. But
Sure.
most of my life, I was among people with a little bit more pure bloodlines,
Okay.
very white, African American, or Asian, and I didn't fit any of those. And I
Sure.
always felt like an outsider. So as a result, I kind of kept to myself. And also, I kept to myself because, God forbid somebody learn of my secrets. So,
Right. Right. So tell us about your near fatal car accident.
oh yes, my near fatal car accident. So by then, I'm now past 20. I'm married. I married young, and I living in Germany. This
Oh.
is my ex-husband, and he was a military officer, and we were living in Germany. And it's funny. I woke up one morning and decided, I think I might be pregnant, and so maybe I better drive and get a test. So I get in my car, and on my way to the dispensary where I was going to get the test, I had this horrible car accident. And in Germany, the lights go from green to yellow to red, then
Hmm.
yellow before green, unlike ours where it goes red to green. So
Right.
you kind of know, like, if you're approaching a red light, you kind of know that it's going to turn green soon because it turns yellow first. And I was approaching this intersection, and it was red, and I had taken my foot off the gas. I had putting on the brakes, and as I'm approaching it, all of a sudden it turned yellow, and I took my foot off the brake, and it turned green, and I accelerated slowly into the intersection. Right
Hmm.
after I entered the intersection, a beer truck came from across the intersection and slammed into my car, and I was in a little tiny Fiat, very
Oh
small
my.
car.
Hmm.
A truck hit me twice. They
Oh.
had to pry open the door to get me out, and put me in an ambulance, took me to the dispensary. I was then put on in a helicopter, taken to the main hospital in Nuremberg, Germany,
Hmm.
where I was in emergency for about 8 hours while they were trying to save my life.
My.
And after they thought they had at least, patched everything up so that I wasn't going to die immediately, they put
Hmm.
me in intensive care. And while in intensive care, they came running out to me saying, we have to do emergency surgery. You're bleeding internally. You're going to die soon if we don't. And they had also discovered I was pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And they told me, well, and you might lose your baby because of the surgery.
Sure.
And I was in surgery for over 14 hours
Oh my.
while they repaired all the internal problems that I had. And I guess it was a little sketchy.
Mm-hmm.
My condition was sketchy during the surgery, but I managed to come out of it alive.
Wow.
And I didn't lose my son, who
That's amazing.
it was really an amazing. I call my son the miracle son because he got through that surgery, and then after I went into labor, and I was in labor for over 60 hours, hard labor. I kind of got lost, forgotten at the hospital.
My goodness.
Yeah, and then after all that time, the doctor who admitted me was off for a day and a half, and he comes back and he says, why is she still here? And they thought, oh, your son's going to be born with brain damage or something, but he came out great. So that was a moment in life where you start wondering, is there something better for me, bigger for me, more important for me to do than just kind of plodding along, being a wife and a mother, and realizing then having my son after going through that, how important it was for me to be a mother for him.
Sure.
And realizing how important that is. And I think I want women to hear this because, I am an attorney, but I didn't become an attorney first. I was a mother first.
Sure.
And I put a lot of my energy into being as good a mother as I could be. And I know there are a lot of women out there. I talk a lot about like life integration. Some people talk about, balancing work and life. And I know a lot of women feel like they are not worthy unless they have a career. And I want them to know that being a mother is a career. It's so important to raise your children with love. And I see so many kids out there, because as an attorney, I've also done juvenile work, who grow up, and I do criminal defense work. People have grown up who did not have parents who loved them and cared for them. And how important that is, that to give your child that sense of home is always your Shangri-La, your place where you can always come home and feel safe.
Yes.
And I didn't have that growing up. My home wasn't safe. And how horrible that is to not have a safe home. So if you're become a mom, and even if it interrupts your career, just remember how important that role is to give your child a safe home. So they always know that they can come home to you when something happens in the world.
Right. So I'd love for you to talk to some of the moms out there that may have gone through some of the same things that you did, being molested and the secrets and stuff. So how do you, if you didn't have a safe haven growing up, how do you create that safe haven for your children? How do you learn that process?
Well, here's what I did. And I was also, in addition to all of that, I was also raised with a mother who was very strict about my performance in school. I had to be the best. One time I came home from class with the math test, and I had the highest grade in the class, and it was a 98. And the next highest grade was low 80s. And I was so proud of it. It was the hardest test we had that year. And I was waiting for her to come home. I was going to show her the test result. And she finally comes home, and I jump out of my room, and I go, look at this. This was the highest grade in the class. It was the hardest test we've had all year. And she stopped, and she looked at it and paused and said, what happened to the other 2 points?
Oh.
And that's how my whole life was in terms of studying.
Sure.
And, and I wanted to be an athlete. And my mother was like, no, you can do that some other time. You have to be the best at school. And it's a lot of pressure to put on. So when my son was born, I vowed to raise him differently than I was raised. And here's what was so hard about that is I made the vow to myself. And in a day or two, I saw myself being just like my mother, like very quickly. Yeah. And I realized that the only way for me to be true to that vow is I had to repeat the vow every single day, several times a day, and repeat it, because we do become what our experience is very
Yes.
easily. And so our default is going to be what we know, because that's how our brains work. It's what we
Sure.
know. So you have to create different habits. And the only way to create a different habit is being aware and at doing something differently, and
Okay.
asking yourself, what would my mother have done, or what my father would have done? What could I do differently? But you have to do this every single day.
Right.
And that's what I did. And I don't know, I can't even tell you why I decided to do that, but I did. And my son does not have some of the craziness that I do about being a perfectionist that kind of hurts you through life,
Hmm.
or this need to keep secrets. Didn't want to have him go through that. And the one thing that I made sure he always felt was safe. I
Okay.
wanted him, like I said, when I watched Perry Mason, I wanted to be the person other people could trust,
Sure.
but I wanted him to feel safe. And I remember when he was in high school having a conversation with him and saying, it doesn't matter what you do. I don't care how bad it is. You
Hmm.
can always come home and tell me, and I will not get mad at you. And I told him, I said, you may have to pay consequences
Sure.
for doing something bad, but I will never be angry with you for telling me. And we kept that line of communication open to this day. And he's 44 years old today, and he still talks to me like his best friend. And I
Oh,
love
that's
it.
wonderful.
And that's something I didn't have. And I'm thrilled that somehow along the line I was able to give that to him. But I think it's just always being unconditional love, never
Hmm.
expecting a return. I never expected him to give me something just because I loved him and give him unconditional love, unconditional safety. Like that was my role, to give him something I didn't have, and
Hmm.
with no expectation of anything in return. And I think that's what unconditional means. And it has paid off in enormously in my life.
That's wonderful. Now, you went through a troubling divorce. Was this before or after you became an attorney? How did all that piece
No,
together?
yeah. So no, the divorce happened. My son was only about 5 years old, and I went through a divorce with my ex-husband, and I was, still in my 20s. And so before I became an attorney, I was working in a law firm at the time, but wishing I could be a lawyer. But my ex was always seemed to be putting roadblocks in front of me wanting to go to school, and so I wasn't getting where I wanted to go. But going through that divorce, I thought, I was threatened that he was going to take my son away from me, because I was the one that wanted the divorce. He thought I should be punished.
Oh, wow.
Um, and and of course, in some ways, all things that I went through as a child, which is no one to trust, no one to turn to,
Hmm.
an unsafe environment, feeling like things that were important to me were going to get taken away from me. Those
Right.
kinds of situations, those all just kind of boiled back up into my mind. And I felt like a caged animal, just trying to crawl, like scratch my way out during the divorce. And somehow I did speak to an attorney, and in the law firm that I worked, we weren't like a divorce law firm, but we
Hmm.
had a couple of the attorneys had handled some divorces, and I understood a little bit about what was going on. So I wrote up a marital settlement agreement and had another attorney, a friend of mine, look at it, and he goes, "You're giving up too much." And they said, "No, I have to give this up because I can't lose my son, and I can't
Hmm.
go through this anymore. It has to end. I can't
Yeah.
afford to fight." And so I did. I gave up a lot. I gave up child support. I gave up spousal support. All the things that I really, if I had gone to court, the judge would have given me.
Sure.
And but I just gave it up because I had to put an end to it. It was just too much. And so, sometimes you have to give up the fight for your own mental health, and wanting to make sure that you come out of it on the other side
Hmm.
with enough in you to be able to keep moving forward and upward. And the idea of losing my son was life crushing.
Sure.
And so I did. And but it takes a while for you to even realize that. But once I realized I had to make a choice, and that becomes, ways to overcome adversity is you have to make choices. What
Yes.
are those choices? And, do you choose to fight something that you have to figure out that when you fight, like a divorce, at the end, you end up with less anyway,
Right.
right? I mean, I'm an attorney, and I will tell you, if you fight too much, the only person that wins is the lawyer, because
Right.
you're going to have to pay the lawyer, and you end up losing. So there's a point where you have to say enough is enough and stop fighting so that there's something left for you to build a life with. And that's the choice that I finally made.
Sure. And we all know fighting, we still have to be an example to our children. And you of course don't want to badmouth the other party, but a lot of that happens anyways throughout divorces. I mean, I've had 2 divorces, so I know exactly what happens. It's not a good situation, and kids are involved. It's difficult. It's hard on everybody, especially the kids, because they usually think it's their fault. How did your son feel during all of this?
When it began, I talked to him quite a bit because he was pretty young. He was only 5 when this was happening. And, he did. He thought it was his fault.
Right.
And I read about that, and I did everything I could to make sure he knew it wasn't his fault, but he still felt that way. So I don't know why children feel that way, but they do. And I think it's very common, and it's in their minds. They just assume it's their fault. And so you have to work really hard to convince them otherwise. And it's talking to them, keeping that communication open. So one of the things that I did do, and I would recommend this with all parents, because let me tell you, when you put those kids anywhere in the middle of a divorce, it wreaks havoc in their lives.
Yes.
And you may not see it right away. May not see it till many years later. I got my ex-husband finally to agree that if we were going to have any discussion about anything we disagreed on, or payment of support, or even visitation, or anything, that we would do it by phone, like during the work hours when our son was at school, or at least where he wasn't around, and we would never discuss any of this in front of him. And he did agree to do that, and I think he kept his end of the bargain, and I did. And I know that one of the things he told me that really crushed me early on was, because you want a divorce, you're going to scar our child for life.
Oh.
And blaming me, that my son might be scarred for life. And after my son was 20 years old, my ex did turn to me and he goes, he wasn't scarred for life. I go, no, he wasn't. And I'm convinced it's because we didn't do battle in front of him.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the adversity that you've been through and how to be successful. Do you have a project or service that you want the world to know about? Or would you like to have your business or project highlighted during the show to a wide audience? If you would like to be a guest or sponsor of the show, please contact us at info@openpagespublishing.com. That's info@openpagespublishing.com. Hi, we're back. And tonight we're talking with Francine Tone about how to overcome adversity and be successful. Francine's been telling us about things that she went through in her childhood and her teen years. And we were just discussing her divorce. Now, Francine, I know once you got through the divorce, at what point did you become ill with cancer?
Actually, this was many years later. I actually had remarried, and I became a lawyer, and then I got cancer, and it was just one of those things you don't expect. And there was some irregularities, and finally my doctor sent me to an oncologist, and they did the DNC, where they scraped the uterus. And my doctor sat me down and said, well, the results are in, you have cancer. And I remember breaking down crying because my adopted mother died of ovarian cancer. And so my only experience with cancer was my adopted mother, who went through chemotherapy twice, went into remission, and shortly before 5 years from remission, she came back. and having to see her suffer through chemotherapy, twice,
Sure.
and then having passed away. She was only 50 years old. She was very
Oh.
young. And I was only about 45 when I discovered I had this cancer in my uterus.
Mhm.
And my doctor immediately set me up for surgery. And we went through, I had surgery, very aggressive surgery. And he came back. I got lucky. I didn't have to have chemotherapy or radiation. He just did such an
Wow.
aggressive surgery. But I developed massive medical problems from it. It was my third abdominal surgery. My first was my car accident,
Right.
near fatal car accident. The second one was when my son was born, because after 60 hours of labor, they did an emergency C-section. So that was my second abdominal surgery.
Mhm.
And then this was my third abdominal surgery. And as a result, I developed a massive scar tissuing, which has now created an intestinal blockage. And so even to this day now, I have to be very careful about what I eat and really pay attention to my body, because I can end up in the hospital on a morphine drip because I'm in such pain, with the
Right.
threat of another abdominal surgery, which could make my condition worse,
Okay.
or have a strangulated intestine, which could kill you, and
Sure.
all these other problems, or end up with a colonoscopy bag, and just all these other things. And so I'm very active. I ski in the winter. I come to Hawaii to surf.
Wow.
And, I spend much of my life today living my life backwards, because I always wanted to be the athlete as a kid that I couldn't be. So now I am that kid now. And having to do, a surgery that could make my intestinal problems worse would be the worst thing in my life. So, but the hysterectomy that I had in that third abdominal surgery almost did me in. And I was supposed to be in the hospital for 2 days after the surgery, because it was, just a very simple process. But I was in there for 2 weeks
Wow. That's
because
a
of the
long time.
complications. Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
Wow. That's really incredible. So I also know that you've written a book. Tell us about your book and where we could find that book.
Okay, so my book, the title of my book is What Every Good Lawyer Wants You to Know, an Insider's Guide on How to Reduce Stress, Reduce Costs, and Get the Most from Your Lawyer. Now, this book, and you can actually go to my website, www.francintone.com, and you can find other books where I've written chapters in those books, and then also this book that I've written, and you can find it on Amazon. And I wrote this book because, I did become a lawyer. And before I became a lawyer, I had worked for other lawyers. And some lawyers I worked for were really good with their clients. And I would admire how they dealt with their clients, because, remember, I want to be my client's Perry Mason.
Right.
And then I worked for other lawyers who didn't handle their clients as well. And I thought, you're not being their Perry Mason. So I learned things like, this is a good way to be. This is not a good way to be. And so by the time I became a lawyer, I had observed a lot with other lawyers. And of course, I wanted to be my client's Perry Mason. So what happened was, I would spend hours of my time without charging my client. And not many lawyers you're going to find doing this.
Right.
And not charging my clients, to make sure that they understood the process of what we're about to go through. And even through the process, making sure they really understood. And when I speak to lawyers, I tell them, these are the things that I tell my clients. And every lawyer will say, well, I tell those things to my clients. And I tell them, the difference is I make sure that my clients understood what was going on, not just check the box that I told them.
Right.
And I would spend hours. Sometimes some clients needed, hand holding more than just hours, sometimes days, and without charge. And this was, as a business person, this was costing me a lot of money, my time.
Yes.
But I did it because that's what I needed to do for my clients. And then I put it all in a book. These are the things that I tell my client, and I put it in a book. And what I discovered was, when I gave the book to the client, my clients were like, oh, wow, I never understood what was going on in this. I get it now. Or I tell them, read the book, and if you have questions, write in the notes, and then come back to me and I'll answer the questions. And this saved me a lot of time with the clients. And it also gave them something they can go back to. And that's why I published this book. And basically, it primes the client to be able to hear my advice as an attorney more effectively. And the reason I finally put it in a book, because I really realized what it was like to be a client when I got sued. And my husband is an attorney, and actually this is my second husband, and he was an attorney, and I was working in the law office where he was, and we got married. And he said, you've always wanted to be a lawyer. Go get your law degree. Wow. So I did, and we became partners. And then at some point we went into a partnership with two other attorneys. And when we broke up, it was one of those breakups where we're like, you know what, we're just going to walk away from it all, just be done with this, move on with our lives, get on with it. And we had hoped they would do the same, because we had documented some things that, we could have sued on, but we didn't. Well, they decided they wanted to sue, so they did.
Oh, no.
This is what lawyers do sometimes. When they break up, somebody ends up suing each other. And I became a client. And I thought, because I was a lawyer and I knew all the internal workings of the legal system and how lawsuits were, that I would be not like clients. Well, that's not true. When you become a party in a lawsuit, you become a client, and you have reactions, emotional reactions, just like any client.
Right.
So I had to hire a good lawyer, and lucky me, because I'm a lawyer, I knew a lot of lawyers, and I knew a good one, and hired a good lawyer who kept me in check. But the advantage I did have over the typical client is I did know the system. So when the attorney said to me, Fran, you need to stop doing this and do this because, and he was giving an explanation, I would go, oh, okay, I hear you. Mm-hmm. Whereas the typical client who doesn't have that background that I had is like, well, why can't I have this? Why can't I do this? They don't understand why the lawyer's saying we have to do this instead of that. Mm-hmm. And that's what I talk about in my book. Okay. Is the kinds of things that lawyers, that clients need to understand. Like one of the things is, why does it take so long for things to get resolved in the courtroom, in the courthouse? Why does sometimes it take so long? Or let's say that you have a hearing scheduled and somehow it has to get postponed for some reason, or a deposition scheduled and it has to be postponed. Why does it take so long to reschedule that? When it's like, why can't we just do it next week? Mm-hmm. And what's the reason behind that? I talk about that in my book. Or the client wants to do research on the internet and send all this information to the attorney. Why does that not help you, but actually could cost you money? Right. And why that's not a good idea. And so instead of just saying, don't do something, is providing the client an explanation as to why that's not a good idea and why some things are a good idea, why some things aren't, so that clients can get them use their time and money most effectively when they're working with a lawyer, instead of just doing things that they think is a good idea when it's not a good idea, and all of a sudden getting this huge bill and going, what happened? How come I have such a big bill?
Okay. So tell us what you mean by getting rid of watches that do you no good to make room in life.
Yes. Okay. So there's another lifetime story on that. So I've mentioned my son, mm-hmm. who was my miracle son, who didn't die when he was in Brielle. He was born wonderfully, even after 60 hours of labor. Mm-hmm. And he grew up to be this wonderful person. He's one of my best friends. And he went to the Air Force Academy and graduated. And he was a pilot, instructor pilot, and about to become an Air Force fighter pilot. So he had a wonderful life in front of him. And then he went off to New Zealand for a dream vacation. His dream vacation was to go to New Zealand with Olympic hopefuls in a ski camp. And it was supposed to be there for 3 weeks. And right after he went there, I'm home I live by Lake Tahoe. I'm home, and I get that phone call. And it's funny because I was getting ready to go on a mountain bike ride, and a lot of times I don't answer the phone when I'm getting ready to do something. And the phone rang, and I told my husband, answer that call. I said, you need to answer that call. Mm-hmm. So he did. And it was that call that no mother wants. There's been an accident.
Oh, no.
And my son, on his first day of skiing, had a freak accident. He's an expert skier. And somehow his ski hit something. He went off the side of the hill, went down. They found him at the bottom of the hill. His head had hit an ice berm that stopped his fall.
Oh.
I don't know how long that fall was,
Mm-hmm.
and he was unconscious at the bottom of a ski hill. And he's in New Zealand, and I'm in California.
Oh my.
So I finally get to his side, and they've induced a coma. And I get there, the doctors tell me he's going to be a vegetable the rest of his life.
Oh no.
And so at that moment, I just kind of took note of that, and I sat there with him, holding his hand. They let me stay with him, and I started noticing changes. And I said, I don't accept the fact that he'll be the vegetable for the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And the doctors were even getting angry with me. And to make a really long story short, my son is not a vegetable for the rest of his life, or at all. He's fully recovered. In fact, right now, he lives in Germany, and he's not an Air Force pilot. He's not in the Air Force anymore, but he does work for the Air Force as a civilian, and he's a strategic military planner for the Air Force in Germany, and far from a vegetable.
That's wonderful.
And but during his recovery, this is what was the most remarkable experience for me, was going through his recovery, because he was severely brain injured. He had a severe traumatic brain injury, and that's why they thought he would be a vegetable for the rest of his life. They were so upset with me because I wouldn't accept their prognosis. They took me into the X-ray room and they showed me his CAT scans, and they go, "Look at these CAT scans," and I'm looking at them. I'm going, I don't. They all looked like everything was white. They all looked the same to me. And I'm like, I don't know what the problem is. And they go, white is bad. White means that all those brain cells have been destroyed forever. And I look up and it's all white.
Oh.
And so at that point I went, okay, I understand what you're telling me. And they go, so you need to accept that he's going to be a vegetable the rest of his life. And I said to the doctors, finally, I said, duly noted. If in 2-3 years nothing has changed, I will accept your prognosis, but I'm not going to give up at the beginning of a journey.
Right.
And that's a line that I've now used so many times when people tell me about things that they're going through, is don't give up at the beginning of a journey. Yeah, things may not work out the way you want. Just,
right.
Brain injury is one of those things where sometimes you don't recover, but don't give up at the beginning of a journey. Play it out, do what you can. And that's what I did. Now, during the recovery, we were in New Zealand for 3 weeks. Then we went to Palo Alto, the brain rehab unit there. And I came in one day, and now he's not a vegetable. He's sitting up in a wheelchair. He's cognizant, but still severely brain damaged. He's still going through the cognitive recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And he went from like a 2-year-old. We had to bring him up, learn how to eat, learn how to wash, learn how to brush his teeth, comb his hair, everything. Sure. It was like having a child all over again. And one day I came in and he's doing this. And I go, what's the matter? He goes, Mom, they gave me a watch that does me no good. And what he was pointing to was a monitor on his wrist. Now, I have a watch on. It looks like this. It's got a block like a watch, a band on it like a watch. It's on his wrist like a watch. And to somebody who's brain injured, it must have been a watch.
Sure.
But it did him no good because there was no face on it, so he couldn't tell time with it. So it was a watch that did him no good because it was a monitor that would send off alarms if he left the brain injury ward.
Okay.
That line became something we used during his recovery and became something we use in our family, is that during the recovery, sometimes he would kind of get stuck on something that really didn't matter. And we would tell him, that's another watch that does you no good. Oh. And he got that. And so my husband and I started using that with each other when we would start focusing on something that didn't do us any good. And we go, that's a watch that does you no good. And a great example was my husband makes a best sandwich in the world. He's really meticulous about making sure every bite, all the meat is in all corners. The lettuce is in all the corners. If he puts mustard or mayo on it, everything is in the corners. So every bite is like the perfect bite of the sandwich. And so he would make this perfect sandwich, leave it on the counter. And I would walk by and take a bite out of it. And he would turn around and he goes, hey, you took a bite out of my sandwich. And I would turn to him and I go, well, that's a watch that does you no good. Because he wasn't going to get the bite back.
Sure.
And it wasn't something to fret over. If he wanted more, he could make another sandwich. And we've been using that constantly to start looking at things in our lives that we spend energy on, time and energy on. And say, it does me no good to spend my time and energy on it. That's a watch that does you no good. And when you start getting rid of those watches, it frees up your brain bandwidth. So this is how I look at it. Over time, we have added so much in our mind.
Yes.
And when you start out, like you're in school and you're thinking about all your classes and your exams, all that stuff is in your head. And then you go to work and all this stuff gets in your head. Your social life, everything gets up in your head. And pretty soon your brain starts to look like rush hour traffic because it's cluttered with so much stuff that we think is important.
Yes.
And part of it is, some of that's not important, but you don't even know how to get rid of it. You're like, it's there, so it must be there forever. And the answer is no, it doesn't have to be. We can start getting rid of these watches that do you no good so that you can free up that rush hour traffic of all the stuff that's cluttered in your brain and get that open freeway. And when you get that open freeway in your brain, now you've got brain bandwidth. You have time and energy in your brain to breathe, to live your life, to be able to integrate your life in a way where you can actually do things that you love to do. You have time. My husband and I always say, you have all the time in the world, so long as you get rid of the watches that do you no good. So when I work with people, I tell them, start with something really, really small, and maybe it's an argument you've had with somebody. And really look at that and say, is holding on to the grudge from that argument really helping you in life? And we discover it doesn't do you any good. Get rid of it.
Right.
And a lot of times we hold on to things, or, I need to express this to somebody. We've got to get off the chest or something. But really, is it going to really make your life better by holding on to that until you have a chance to confront that person? The answer is generally no.
Probably
it doesn't
not.
make
Yeah.
your life better at all.
Right.
So let it go now. And, so instead of being angry with somebody or holding on to something that your experience with somebody, let's say somebody insulted you and you want to, let them know how that made you feel. Is that really doing you any good? Probably not.
No.
So you can just get rid of it and just take it off your plate. And then pretty soon you start getting rid of big things. Maybe it is a spouse that's doing you no good, or a job or something.
Right.
And you start getting rid of the big things, but you have to start with the small things because it's hard to get rid of the big things until you've learned to kind of create a comfort with getting rid of some little things, right? And so, but those are the watches that do you no good. And I look at that as watches that do you no good suck away time and energy.
Yes.
And when you start getting rid of those, you start acquiring a little time and a little energy. And to me, when you get time and energy back, that's when you start getting freedom back.
Yes. That is wonderful. Francine, I want to thank you. We have about a minute left. Thank you so much for being on the show. Again, what's the name of your book and your website?
My book is What Every Good Lawyer Wants You to Know. And my website is www.francintone.com. And it was a pleasure being here, Michelle. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. We were very glad to have you. And I tell you, you've got the most beautiful smile that brightens up the whole screen. So we were so happy to have you. So this is Michelle Bannister, and I'm reminding you to start today and live the life you were meant to live.